Hello and welcome to another water cooler conversation. This time around we're going to focus on the two big recent NHS announcements. So the first being the letter from Sara Hurley dated 19th of July, which deals with NHS contract reform, and the second announcing a 4.5% rise in NHS pay, which we should probably, before we start, should probably preclude that doesn't necessarily mean a 4.5% rise in NHS dental contracts. In fact, it almost certainly won't mean that, because normally what happens is they only award that on the pay element, and of course an NHS dental contract normally is split into a pay element and a service element. So what we don't know at the time of recording is what the actual what proportion of that 4.5% will be applied to NHS dental contracts.
Yeah, and as you say, Luke, there's these are the biggest changes since about 2006. So we're seeing some quite significant changes here. What impact do you think initially it'll have on the profession?
Well, obviously the letter, if you like, there was kind of a number of announcements within the letter. The first, which is probably, I think, the biggest non-announcement there was, is that there's now going to be a minimum UDA value of £23. Now, our experience of value is actually given the number of kind of pay rises that have been since the contract was first put into place in 2006, means that there aren't many practices out there now with a UDA value of £23, and the argument is that actually it is still incredibly hard to deliver in the current recruitment climate, in the current inflationary climate with materials and labs, to deliver NHS practice at £23 a UDA. So I think on that first point, I don't think they went far enough.
No, I don't.
Especially when you consider that actually they are tendering UDAs in all around the UK in various different areas where people have given back their contract at £30 a UDA. So it does kind of make you wonder what the thinking is if they think, oh, well, if we're going to tender at £30 a UDA, which I think last time I was quoted, it cost something like £250,000 to run a tender exercise, but we'll give the existing providers who don't cost us £250,000 to continue delivering their NHS where they've got established patients and where there's no break in service, we're only going to pay them a minimum of £23.
Yeah, and this other point about the unilateral reduction of the contract if they underperform, I think about 96% in 3 consecutive years.
Yeah. From a goodwill perspective, of course, there is an argument there are a number of practices which are sold on the basis of the fact that the current dentists have been underperforming for a given reason. It could be health related, could be recruitment related, and you get people, if you like, who pay a premium for a practice that could deliver a higher level of NHS activity. But I think it's probably fair to say that in more recent years that actually that isn't the case, and a lot of people are heavily discounting that additional contract value. And also there's an argument to say that that extra monies that hasn't been delivered, if it's been delivered in private income, often is more profitable anyway. So whilst I think you're right, is that maybe from a legal risk perspective, if there is underperformance at a level of say 94, 95%, you are going to maybe see some more nervous purchasers and nervous banks in funding those acquisitions. But those practices which were significantly underperforming, to be honest, we probably weren't including that income in any goodwill apportionment or any goodwill valuation anyway. So again, an announcement that in my view doesn't really affect dental practice goodwill in any material sense. And
it sounds like as well they'll listen to anything, if you've got a reason for it or if you've put something into to rectify that, there will be some leeway there. Is that how you read it?
Yeah, I kind of read it that way. So as you say, like using health as an example, I think again it will come down to individual area teams. There's still that room for discretion, which unfortunately does often mean that there's more disputes and the lawyers get very rich. But it's one of those things, in practice, this letter had lots of announcements in there, but actually a lot of the announcements didn't really do a lot.
Okay, so shall we move on to the 4.5% pay rise?
Yes, the 4.5% pay rise, which, to be fair, obviously we estimate that's probably going to look more like 3% by the time it gets through the system. That's what we're working on at the moment. But of course, 3% actually still isn't that much in the context of the climate that we're in. I think, inflation was over 9% when we last looked at it on the 22nd of June. And you've got to consider that, obviously inflation, depending on what measure you're using, but you've got to look at wage inflation. So this year, wages, the minimum wage went up by 6%, and we've done another 6.6%, and we've done another water cooler on what the impact of that is. We've got the introduction of the National Insurance Levy, which has added another 1.25% on the cost of employing someone. You've then got inflationary pressures on materials, on lab fees. You've got massive wage inflation on associates because there isn't enough associates to go around. So whereas you might have budgeted a practice at £10 a UDA, you're now budgeting at £12 a UDA, which is a 20% increase. So 4.5% on paper in other years would have looked great, but again, it's probably not something that's really in truth, it's probably, in the grand scheme of things, probably going to get to about an equilibrium position, depending on the area of the UK. But if you're in a region, then actually it's probably not going to make an enormous amount of difference.
Okay, fine. So, I mean, how would you sort of sum all these announcements up then?
Well, I mean, there were a couple of, obviously there were some more positive points. I know we've been quite negative, but there was the points about, with regard to like the band 2. So, to encourage dentists, where they're doing, say, more than 3 fillings or treatments on an individual patient, they're now going to get more UDAs than what they would have done under the previous regime. And that's a positive, and that will help practices, particularly in areas where they've had, they take on lots of new patients, or where they've got patients where oral health, is more unsettled. That will make those kind of practices more attractive, undoubtedly. And I think from a recruitment perspective as well, that might make it slightly easier when you've got associates who are looking around going, well, I don't want to work in that practice because I will have this new patient, so I want an established list. It's not going to solve the problem, but it might make it slightly easier. So that's a real positive. Of course, there was the announcement with regard to dental therapists as well, which is probably an interesting one, because we've trained a lot of dental therapists in the UK, most of whom are now working as dental hygienists because we've never really worked out how to use them in the current dental system. And of course, this gives a little bit more freedom to use dental therapists, particularly in an area where recruitment is really, really tough. But it doesn't deal, again, with one of the issues of dental therapists, which a lot of practices I've worked with have struggled with, is that the output per hour in terms of volume of UDAs against what a dentist's output per hour is, isn't comparable. So by the time you staff the nurse, you run the chair, you staff reception, actually you're looking at that individual surgery and saying, actually, is it viable to have a dental therapist in there? And for some of those practices with high UDA values, that might work out okay, because of course if you look at the orthodontic model now, the orthodontic method of NHS delivery in the main is quite heavily therapist led, but is it going to be something that overnight is unilaterally going to solve NHS England's problems with dental contracts? Probably not. So yeah, I mean that pretty much sums up the letter. I mean there isn't enormous amount of content in it. I mean some people may disagree with me on dental therapists, and we would love to see the dental therapy model work in practice. So if you've got an example, if you're watching this video and you're saying actually I've seen it work really well, I disagree. I think dental therapists can add a lot to those practices in assisting with the delivery of NHS contracts, then please do drop a comment, and happy to discuss it with you. And likewise, obviously, 4.5% is, or 3%, whatever it turns out to be, is better than nothing, which is what we thought we were getting, given the fact that the timing of this announcement. So. Positives generally, obviously the market's still strong. As we've discussed before, the private market probably still busier than the NHS market, but yeah, be good.
Lovely, thank you.